Bob had been getting sick for several weeks, and every day he was feeling weaker and having more symptoms, and he was struggling. So after several weeks of this, he finally goes to the doctor, and his wife of 30 years goes with him, and they go in, and the doctor does a series of examinations and different tests and blood work and all of that. And the doctor comes back and he says, "Ma'am, can I talk with you in my office?" And so he takes the wife into his office and he says, "I wanted to tell you what's going on first. Bob has this really rare form of anemia. And without proper treatment, it's going to kill him. He'll only live a few months. But with the right nourishment and stuff, that he'll be able to live a fairly normal life. But what you're going to need to do is make sure that he eats well. So, you're going to need to get up every morning and cook a big breakfast. Bacon and eggs and pancakes and a good lunch every day. And every night, just a meat and potatoes meal for him to make sure he's eating well. And it'd be great if you could bake some, and bake breads and cakes and just make sure that he's taking in the calories that he needs. And the other thing is his immune system is really weak. And so you're going to need to just keep the house spotless because he can't really afford to be in a house that's not really clean." And she said, "Doctor, I understand." And he said, "Well, do you want to tell your husband or do you want me?" And she said, I'll tell him." And so she goes out, she goes back into the exam room where Bob is, and Bob is nervous and he can tell something's wrong. And he says, "Honey, it's bad, isn't it? What's going to happen to me?" And she burst into tears and said, "Honey, you're going to die." There's some truth to that because we don't like to think about love and marriage as being hard work, of daily doing the little things that make love work. We like this idea that love just flourishes really without any effort on our part, that things just kind of take care of themselves. But here's what that wife in the joke didn't understand. That when she cooked those breakfasts for her husband, that wasn't just breakfast sustaining her husband. It would be the fuel that sustained her family. It would be the thing that her grandkids would talk about years later when they described their grandmother and the kind of life she lived. Legacy is what we're talking about today. And legacy isn't built in one moment. Legacy is built with a day at a time, one little thing after another. It's the invisible effort over many years that drives legacy. Well, we've spent the last 3 weeks talking about physical intimacy in this marriage series called Hot Summer Nights. And the first week we talked about God's plan for intimacy. And then in the second week, we went into some detail about how to improve physical intimacy in our marriages. And then in week 3, Chris last week talked about the problems that we can run into when it comes to this aspect of marriage and physical intimacy, and how God can help us restore and repair those relationships. And today I want to kind of wrap up this story of physical intimacy. And we've been talking about it all 4 weeks with the concept of an arrow. And this arrow it represents the tool of physical intimacy that God gave us to hit the target in our marriage of becoming one flesh. And so today I'm going to talk less about how to shoot the arrow and more about what happens when this arrow flies true year after year, and the effect that it has on your families and on your kids, and how that impacts generations to come. Let's go back to the passage that we've looked at every week of this series. These are the words of Jesus, and he's quoting from the Old Testament book of Genesis. And here's what he says about marriage. In Mark 10:6-9, he says, "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." And that's been the point of this series, because that's the point of marriage. That is the goal for marriage, to become one flesh with one another. And physical intimacy is a significant tool that God gave us to help us become one flesh. And this oneness, this one flesh relationship, leads to a lifetime of contentment and joy and happiness in our marriage. After our worship service a couple of weeks ago where I talked about some details about physical intimacy and how to improve that aspect of our marriage. I was out in the lobby and I was talking to one of our older couples. They're in their 80s. They've been in our church a while and they've been married a long time. And they said, as I was talking about details of physical intimacy, they were both thinking, I remember that. I remember what that was like. And that's the goal, is for it to create this lifetime of oneness. But God is actually doing something bigger than that. The story that's being told through your marriage is bigger than just the two of you. This one flesh union is your legacy that impacts your family, your home, and even the generations that come after you. I don't know if you know much about the arrow that rolled onto the floor here, but this arrow is made up of different parts, and this back end of the arrow, and we've talked about this almost every week, is called the fletching. And originally the fletching was made out of feathers, but now it's made mostly of rubber. But what that fletching does is cause the arrow to spin. And it's like, a football thrown by a quarterback or a bullet coming out of a rifle. That spinning helps the arrow to fly straight and true. And so what we've been talking about is that when the fletching, this back end, becomes damaged, it makes it harder to hit the target of becoming one flesh because the arrow doesn't fly as straight and true. But today, we want to talk about the effect of an arrow that flies straight and true over the years, and candidly, an arrow that doesn't fly as straight and true in your marriage. We want to talk about the generational impact of becoming one flesh with your spouse. I want you to check out this video of me and my wife. We're riding in the car with my two grandkids, and you get this little glimpse of what we get to experience because of our marriage together for 37 years. Check this out. Those little moments are things that we only experience together because we've had a 37-year marriage where we have kids that have had kids, and we get to be a part of their life. There's a generational impact to our relationships. And we want to raise kids that have kids of their own, and we want to show them what real marriage looks like, what true relationship looks like, what it looks like to have a marriage that brings honor and glory to God and brings joy and happiness to us. I don't think a lot of us think about our sex life as protecting our kids, but it actually does. Because when mom and dad are happy and they're physically attracted to one another and they still love that aspect, there's a different temperature in the home. There's less stress at the dinner table. It can be felt by the kids. I can't tell you how many times I've counseled with couples who are struggling in their marriage. Nobody told the kids what was going on in the bedroom, but the kids knew something was not right. They knew that there was a problem in the home. They could feel the distance between mom and dad. Oneness, or a lack of oneness, doesn't stay contained in your bedroom. It leaks into every room in your house. We're teaching our kids what their marriages should look like, what love looks like, what the whole concept of marriage looks like by what our relationship looks like. Look at what Moses told parents in Deuteronomy 6:6-7. He says, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up." Now, we quote this a lot, and usually we're talking about teaching your kids about God, and that's the primary meaning of this passage of Scripture. But we're also teaching our kids something about what God's plan for marriage looks like by the way we treat our spouse, by the way we love them, by the way we treat our spouse when we lay down at night and we get up in the morning together, or we don't. Make no mistake, you are leaving a legacy for your kids by how you love your spouse, by how you cherish your spouse and how you interact with them in the home. That legacy may be a successful picture of what a healthy relationship looks like, or it may be a legacy of broken promises and unfulfilling connections. And the legacy, either good or bad, will be the arrow that you hand down to your kids. and it will be the arrow that they potentially hand down to their kids that come later. And so we want to get this issue of becoming one flesh, we want to get it right because the stakes are really high. So here's our first truth about the legacy of physical intimacy. What you don't repair, you pass down. Remember back in week 1, I told you that all of us are being discipled about sex, that we're being discipled about sex by movies, by the internet, by school, by our friends, by the people we come into contact. And I also said your kids are being discipled about sex. One of the areas that they're learning from, and one of the ways they're learning about God's plan for sex in marriage is by watching you. And they're being discipled and affected. The reality is this: your kids are learning less about what a healthy physical relationship looks like from that one terribly uncomfortable conversation you have about the birds and the bees, and they're learning way more by how you and your spouse interact. It's important. We want to have that level of love and that level of intimate connection that displayed from mom and dad so that it gives that home security and energy. Look, this isn't something I just thought up. It's established by years of research and study. Researchers at Penn State University spent 21 years tracking 297 parent-child relationships, so it's a bunch, all the way from the early 1980s through the end of the 1990s. And what they did was they looked at these 297 families to see what effect the parents' relationship with one another had on the kids' marriage relationship many years later. And what they learned should really change the way we think about the impact of our marriage on our kids. Because what they found is it's not just divorce that negatively impacts the kids' later relationships. It's discord and discontent that gets passed down. And it went so far that these researchers could actually identify the negative traits that pass from the parents' marriage down to the kids' marriage. And some of the ones they identified were things like jealousy, one parent being domineering, uncontrolled anger, being critical of one another, being moody and not talking to your spouse for significant periods of time. They said that the struggles of the parents are learned by the children, and then they're typically re-show up in the relationships later in life. That's the curriculum that you're giving your kids by how you love your spouse. That's why it's so important. In other words, your marital harmony translates into your kids' marital harmony. Your marital discord often translates into their marital discord unless they can break that legacy, if they can change that. In other words, if your home is full of silence, that's probably what their is going to look like. If there's a lack of affection, if mom and dad rarely touch, never flirt, don't seem physically attracted to each other, your kids are learning that their marriage is really just a business partnership that is not really filled with love and affection. If your home is full of tension and coldness, or intimacy is being used as a weapon, and there's silence and withdrawal by one or both spouses, they're learning what relationships look like for their marriages down the road, because we have a tendency to repeat what we've learned. Some of you guys may know exactly what I'm talking about because you grew up in a home where it was just uncomfortable with mom and dad. They didn't have a good relationship. And maybe you grew up in a house where you just grew up feeling like intimacy was shameful, or that intimacy was just something that no one ever talked about because it wasn't important, or it was used to control one of the spouses, or it was used as a weapon. And so what happened is you didn't get a well-fletched arrow when you started your own marriage because you didn't have a healthy understanding of what marriage even looked like and what a healthy physical relationship in marriage was like. Be the generation that changes the legacy. You have that, and we're going to talk about what that looks like. It takes hard work. It's not always easy, but it's the exactly kind of work that God specializes in. All right, here's our second truth about the legacy of physical intimacy. Don't let hesitation keep you from changing. Some of you guys, you recognize the struggles in your marriage. You know exactly what's going on, but you hesitate to change. You just can't seem to make it different. And so I want to talk just a minute for what causes us to hesitate, what causes us to keep from making the changes so that we can restore a healthy love and physical intimacy in our marriage. And I think one of the biggest ones is fear. Marriages stay the same year after year, day after day, week after week, because the husband and the wife, they're afraid to try again. And maybe that's where you are. Maybe you're in a situation where you tried to fix it years ago and it didn't work and it left you disappointed and disillusioned. And you've thought about maybe trying again, but you just struggle with the idea of being disappointed. And you wonder, can we really even make a difference? Is it too late? Is this even worth the effort? And look at me. Those are real fears. That's real, not imagined. But let me tell you what fear is doing for you. Fear is preserving, keeping you from disappointment. But it's doing that by holding you in a disappointing relationship year after year. Fear is keeping you from potentially being disappointed and causing you to absolutely be disappointed in where you are in your marriage because you stay exactly where you are instead of taking the risk and finding a marriage that brings you joy and creating the legacy that you want to leave for your kids and generations after you. Staying where you are isn't actually choosing the safe way out. It's choosing a slow spiral and deterioration rather than a risky hope for something different. As Christians, our lives are not supposed to be driven by fear. The Bible talks over and over, do not fear. Listen to Isaiah 41:10. It says, so do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. As followers of Jesus, we're not to have a spirit of fear. We are to have hope in the God who loves us. And I think what happens to us is we forget who we are. As followers of Jesus, we follow a God who died and rose from the dead. And let's be honest, if death isn't too late to overcome a bad result, nothing is. Your marriage is not too late. If God can bring Jesus back from the dead, he can bring your marriage back from the dead. Our God turns death into life, hopelessness into hope, and desperation into deliverance. Don't let fear keep you from taking the steps that are necessary to bring excitement and intimacy back into your marriage. I've counseled couples over the years who have a marriage that is in a desperate situation. Some of them just coming out of an affair. And I've watched some of those marriages go from being in bad situation to being better than they ever were even before the affair. They didn't just survive, they thrived. Now, it took hard work. It took forgiveness, sometimes not once, but forgiveness over and over and over. It took effort and energy and prayer, but I've watched that happen. I tell couples who are struggling in their marriage that it may not happen overnight. It took you years to get where you are. So it may take some time to right the ship. But God can change your marriage and make it the big, beautiful ocean we talked about in week 1. He has the power to do that. But you got to get out of your comfort zone and make it happen. Don't let fear keep God from giving you the physical intimacy and bringing joy back into your marriage. But sometimes it's not fear that keeps us from trying to make a difference and making change. It's pride. See, here's what pride says. Pride says, look, I'm not the problem, so I'm not going to be the one to change. He caused this, or she caused this, so they can be the first one to do something different. They can be the one to apologize. They can be the one to reach out first. They can be the one to change first. But pride is one of the most dangerous sins in all the Bible. And I think it may be the sin that God hates the most if you look at what the Bible has to say about pride. Pride keeps you from having a right relationship with your spouse, and it also destroys your relationship with God. Look at Proverbs 16:18-20, what it says. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. That's a little concern. Destruction is not something we're looking for in our marriage. Better to be lowly in spirit along with the oppressed than to share plunder with the proud. Whoever gives heed to instruction prospers, and blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord. Here's the uncomfortable truth about pride. Pride will always feel justified in the moment. and it will always cost you later on. Pride has never once repaired this error. Cannot do it. Humility is what makes changes in a relationship. Humility makes the first move, even when you feel like you're only 10% at fault. What I've learned in my own marriage is that pride has often put me on the couch, either figuratively or literally. Because my wife and I, over the years, we've had a lot of sleepless nights because neither one of us wanted to be the first one to reach back out to the other one and restore relationship. It was the other person's fault. They caused this fight, so they're going to be the one that comes and makes it right. And you spend all night thinking about that. Pride will tell you to stand up for your principles while it cheats you out of happiness. It takes humility to heal a marriage that's struggling. But sometimes the wound is old enough that it's not fear and it's not pride. It's become bitterness. And bitterness is robbing you of the relationship you want. You've replayed that offense and the hurt from that offense just over and over until it's become calcified. And now it's something you guard against and protect rather than something you want to heal. We can hesitate to change our marriage for the better because we're drowning in a sea of bitterness. Look at Ephesians 4, 26 through 27, and we're going to talk first about how not to get into a situation of bitterness. Paul says in Ephesians, he says, in your anger, do not sin. Got to be, in other words, anger is dangerous. Be very careful when you're angry, but that you do not sin. Do not let the sun go down while you're still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold. And I love the description that we get in this verse. It gives this idea that anger becomes a foothold. And I think about this like a ledge that a climber uses. The climber's trying to get up the wall, that Satan's trying to get up the wall of your marriage. And when you get angry, you give him a little foothold. You give him something to pull up on so that he can climb a little higher to try to get over the wall. And so it's important that we don't let anger and bitterness become a foothold. Studies have shown that bitterness is a leading cause of divorce and marital discontent. Chris talked a lot about this last week. It's better to resolve a fight sooner rather than later, because the longer the argument lasts, the more it leads to scars and hurt and bitterness. If my wife and I have a fight in the evening and I go to bed before we resolve the fight, I generally don't sleep much. And I wake up the next morning, I'm still mad about what happened the night before, but I'm also now angry that she cost me a night of sleep. Anybody been there? And so what happens, at least from my personal experience, is when you let a fight go through the night, you're going to pretty much be mad at least all the way through that next day as well until you resolve it. And so I believe that the Bible means what it says, and you should do everything you can to make sure that you end that fight before you go to bed in the evening, if that's possible. Don't let bitterness gain a foothold. For husbands and wives, makeup sex, that's a good thing. When you think about the beauty of what God did with physical intimacy, he did it so that we could become one flesh. And one of the ways he does that is helping us overcome things even when we're struggling in our relationship. Sex also releases a chemical called dopamine in our brain. It works as an antidepressant. It works as a painkiller and a stress reliever. How's that for giving you some calmness and relaxation in your marriage so you can get some sleep? God gave us this beautiful tool, this arrow that he gave us so that we could become one flesh. We could be drawn together even when things are tough and we're struggling with conflict. Now, let me be clear. Makeup sex isn't a magic trick to avoid difficult conversation. And sometimes the difficult conversation needs to happen before physical intimacy can occur. But for the small, everyday friction kind of things, just the you heard wrong, they said it wrong, didn't come out the right way, had lots of fights in my marriage over that, it's perfect for that because it lets you soften your heart enough that you can talk it out instead of just stewing in your anger. The goal is never let bitterness gain a foothold. But what if it's too late? What if it's too late to get past the little foothold and bitterness has taken hold? Maybe it's not one resolved fight, but it's years of unresolved fights stacked on top of one another until there's just an underlying anger and bitterness and lack of forgiveness. And in your relationship, you're no longer trying to prevent Satan from getting a ledge to climb up the wall to get into your marriage. He's already over the wall and he's in your house. And some of you are in that situation. And there's only one thing that can change when bitterness takes hold, and that's forgiveness. And every time I talk about forgiveness, people get a little uncomfortable because we're holding on to something that we really don't want to give up because it just feels right to be still angry and upset. But forgiveness is the difficult decision that separates you from the marriage you want. And if you're in that situation, you've got to decide, what is bitterness costing me? What is it costing us in our relationship? And then am I willing to let that go and give that to God? God doesn't tell us to forgive because the other person made it all right. God doesn't tell us to forgive because the offense and the injury is no longer important to you. That's not what he says at all. He says something very different. He says forgive because you've been forgiven of a debt that you can never repay. Look at Colossians 3:13. It doesn't say forgive if what was done to you wasn't a big deal or if the hurt isn't there anymore. It says bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has a grievance against someone. And this is the tough part. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And what that's saying is forgive because you were forgiven. You were forgiven of every sin that you've ever committed. You were forgiven of every sin that you'll ever commit when you're a follower of Jesus. Jesus went to the cross to do that for you. And so it's saying you can forgive others. You can forgive your spouse. Forgiveness was never meant to wait for a grievance to feel small. It was meant to cancel out a grievance while it was still a big deal. It's hard work, it's difficult. But you got to recognize what bitterness is doing to you. And holding on to that bitterness, it doesn't make what the other person did right. It's just as wrong whether you forgive or you hold on to bitterness. But you can choose to forgive. Now, in complex situations, forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. It's not like you just go, all right, I'm done, and you move on. It requires forgiveness over and over and over until the wound heals. But forgiveness does start with a decision. And my challenge to you is to forgive today, if you're in this situation, to make that decision. You can choose in this moment to let the bitterness go. And once you do that, you can begin to restore intimacy and you can begin to build the legacy that you want to build for your kids and your grandkids. No matter what was done to you, you can choose to forgive. May not be easy, may take hard work. What was done to you may have been completely wrong, but you can. Bitterness only causes you pain, and it only separates you and your spouse and holds you apart. Forgiveness allows intimacy to take root and to regrow. All right, here's our final truth about legacy and physical intimacy. It's not too late to change your legacy. See, some of you guys, you've been sitting here this whole sermon series going, Nathan, you do not realize how long physical intimacy has been wrong in our marriage. You're right. Maybe it's been 2 years. Maybe it's been 20 years. But it is never too late to restore this area of your relationship. Your legacy isn't determined by how long you've messed up. Your relationship is determined how you end. And let me be real honest. You can't change the way you start. That's in the past. That's done. But you can change the way it ends. You can change the finish. And the finish is what your kids and your grandkids will inherit. I think about this like the book of Job in the Old Testament. It's this beautiful book of loss and restoration. So Job loses basically everything a man can lose. He lost his family. He lost his wealth. He lost his health. He lost the feeling of physical closeness to God. And I love that Job doesn't gloss over the loss. It doesn't gloss over the difficulty. In fact, it spends a lot of chapters processing the difficulty. But the end of the story changes everything. And that story doesn't need to gloss over the first part because the second part, the healing and the restoration, is rich enough and faithful enough that people remember it. And your marriage can have that same arc. Maybe the first part, maybe the first 20, 30 years have not been anything to write home about. But that doesn't mean that the ending can't become something better. Some of you guys need to fix some things in your marriage, and specifically in this area of physical intimacy. But let's be honest. Some of you guys, it's messed up so bad, you need to start over. I read about a marriage counselor, and he will tell couples that are really struggling in their relationship. He's like, look, this is too much of a mess. You cannot fix it at this point. You need to start over in a new marriage with your spouse. Now, he's not talking about divorce here. He is talking about getting rid of the old habits, the old patterns, the old sins, and making a recommitment and starting over fresh. And look, I get that feels a little naive until you think about it this way. Isn't that what Jesus did for our soul? When we followed Jesus, he took all of that broken mess, all of that sin and failure. And the Bible says we become a new creation. We become clean and new. And if Jesus can do that for our soul, he can also do that for our marriages. I don't know what that looks like for you. Maybe for some of you, it's just a tearful conversation this afternoon or this evening where you say, I get we've grown distant. I get that we've got problems, and I want to take responsibility for the part that I played in that. Maybe some of you guys need to have a vow renewal, and you need to remake those commitments to one another in front of God. We owe it to ourselves to deepen physical intimacy in our marriage relationships, but we also owe it to the generations that come after us. When mom and dad have a healthy physical relationship, there's a different attitude they have, even in public, and it can be felt by the kids. There's more laughter at the dinner table. There's a security that the kids can feel even if they can't explain it. There's less tension in the home. Kids should not know the details of your physical intimacy, but they should absolutely benefit from the fruit of that. A husband and wife who are close, who still flirt in the kitchen, who still steal a kiss when they pass in the hallway. Kids hear that. They see that. You're building a home that your kids feel secure in and that show them what intimacy looks like in their own marriages one day. Sometimes when my wife and I kiss and the kids are there, they'll still say, ooh, old people kissing. Usually it's a mistake when they do that because then I'll dip their mom over and kiss her really good. And they'll feign disappointment and embarrassment and disgust. But in that moment, we're giving them a lesson. We're giving them a sermon on what a marriage looks like. Now, I want to be really clear. My marriage is not perfect. My kids have seen us fight and argue, but they've also seen us make up and move on. Our marriage is filled with love and with intimacy. We have issues, we have problems, we don't always get along, but we show them how we deal with that. When our kids come into the bedroom at night to talk to us and they see mom and I snuggled up in the bed, we're giving them a lesson on what marriage looks like. They're getting a sermon. They just don't recognize that it's a sermon. And what's happening in your home is also preaching to your kids as well. It's teaching them about marriage and about love. And let's be clear. The question is not, are your kids learning something about marriage from your marriage? They are. The only question is, what are they learning? And look, this isn't just my observation as a husband and father and pastor. It's backed up by research. There was a research study out of China that tracked 450 different preschool students. So it's a big study. And they looked at the parent-child relationship over a 3-year period when the marriage got better. So in year one, where the marriage relationship got better and there was more warmth and less negativity between the parents, what they found was a year later, in year 2, that there was more warmth between the parent and the child and less negativity. And that was both true for the father and the mother. And then in year 3, they found that the connection between the parent and the child was way more close than it had been in year 1. In other words, the relationship between the spouses translate into the relationship with the kids. Then the researchers said the results about as directly as scientists ever say anything. Here's what they said. Happy marriages produce sensitive parenting. Conflicted marriages produce harsh parenting. There was a separate study that found that parents' marital happiness, their relationship, impacted how their kids behave at school and their grades, and how good the grades were. 4 years later, they looked at it. Here's the good news if you're sitting there going, Nathan, man, I wish you'd have told me this 20 years ago. You do not need 30 years of a perfect marriage to reset things. You just got to make a change. You just have to start. Reach out for your spouse's hand. Turn to your spouse tonight when you get in bed instead of turning away. Choose forgiveness. Say that sentence that you've been rehearsing in your mind, but you just can never find the right time to do it. This single decision that you make, it doesn't erase the past. It doesn't change all of the arrows that have come before, but it does create a new arrow that will fly more straight and true. And hopefully it's an arrow that then you hand down to your kids and that they hand down to their kids. The decision you make today to have a closer relationship with your spouse can literally impact people that aren't even born today. That's how important this is. So let me ask you, what do you actually believe about your marriage? Do you believe that it's too late for anything to ever be different? Or do you believe that the story is not yet written? It's only one or the other. And let's be clear, one of those is a lie. Look back at the book of Job. When Job, everything falls apart for Job, there's 30 chapters where his friends are going, man, it's too late. It's over. Your life was a wreck. And it wasn't too late. And the same is true for your marriage. Don't let hard years convince you that something is not better. God says that with effort and his power, it's possible. I told you in week 1 of this series that so many of us, we settle for the pool. You know, this comfortable situation instead of trying to find the big, beautiful ocean that God intended our marriages to be. And let's be honest, for some of you, the pool feels pretty safe. I mean, you can see the bottom, you know exactly what's in the pool, you don't know, you know exactly what's coming, nothing's going to surprise you. And the ocean's different. I get it. It's dangerous, it's unknown, there's currents that you don't know and you can't control. The only way to experience the ocean in your marriage is to swim together. And you have to make a commitment to do that. God did not design your marriage to be a pool that you stand in or you tread water in. He designed it to be an ocean that you spend a lifetime discovering together. Settling for the pool, it doesn't take a lot of effort. In fact, if you just kind of do nothing when you leave today, you'll stay in the pool. It's what happens when nobody does anything different. But moving to the ocean requires a decision, and then it requires effort. Everything we've talked about over the last 4 weeks can be put into play. The arrow, the legacy, it's not too late. All of that stays just a nice idea until you make a decision to do something different and explore the ocean together as a couple. Some of you have been hanging out in the pool so long, it feels safe. It feels normal. But you've mistaken safe for satisfied. Don't make that mistake. Don't believe that God brought you to the end of this sermon series for you just to be happier in the pool. That's not his goal of this series. His goal is for you to dive into the ocean and to have the big relationship that he wants you to have. Moving requires action. It's possible to sit here, nod your head all the way through these last 4 weeks, and leave today and do nothing different. Because agreeing with the truth is very different than putting a truth to work in your life. Listen how the earthly half-brother of Jesus says this in James 1:22. He says, do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. In other words, the truth about God's intent for marriage, you can believe it and still die in the pool if you don't put it into action. It requires effort. Don't wait for the kids to be bigger, things to be easier at work, for different circumstances to happen. All of those things are just excuses to stay in the pool. And that's not what God wants for your marriage. Take the first step. Have the conversation. Make the apology. Be the one to reach out first and reinitiate the intimacy that God intended. Swimming in the ocean, it's a little scary if you hadn't been there. But it's worth the effort. So let me get real practical as we wrap up. Somebody in this room needs to do one of 3 things today and this week. And I want you to know which one it is for you and your marriage before you leave the room today. Some of you need to have a conversation, just a tough conversation, maybe filled with tears, where you admit that things have gone cold. And you admit your responsibility in damaging the arrow over the months or the years. You don't need perfect words. You just need to be honest. And you don't need to wait. If you've been waiting for the perfect moment, it's never going to come. Make the perfect moment by taking the step. Go home and say the sentence that you've been rehearsing in your head for months. Some of you guys, you need to lay down pride. You've been waiting for the other spouse to make the first move, to be the one that apologizes, to be the one that reaches out, to be the one that changes first. God's not asking us to keep score of who's caused this and who's done that. He's asking us to reach out to one another, to forgive, to make the decision. Don't let bitterness become the reason you don't have the marriage you want. Be the 10% that goes first. Be the one who reaches out first. And then some of you simply need to reach out your hand. Tonight in bed, you need to be the one that turns toward your spouse rather than turning away. Small reaches, small moments done consistently over time. That's what builds the legacy. That's what helps us grow and get to the ocean. Fear will tell you it's safer to wait. Don't do it now. But fear is just continuing to choose slow pain over a risky hope. Over this last 4 weeks, we've kind of talked about one picture, this arrow, and this beautiful tool that God gave us in marriage to grow closer to become one flesh. And so in week 1, we talked about God's design for this arrow. In week 2, we talked about how to improve your ability to shoot straight and become one flesh with this arrow. Then last week, Chris talked about what happens when this arrow becomes damaged and how you, with God's power and love, can restore that. And today we've talked about how that arrow impacts the people that come after you, where it's headed. Your marriage was never designed to be just about the two of you. It was intended to create a legacy. Somebody is watching you, and maybe several somebodies are watching you. How do you treat one another at the dinner table? What's your affection for one another? How do you talk when you're in the car or when you're in moments alone where you don't even think anybody's watching? And from the way you treat your spouse, they're drawing conclusions about things. They're drawing conclusions about God. They're drawing conclusions about love. They're drawing conclusions about what marriage is even for. Look, let's be honest. Some of you got handed an arrow by your parents that's all messed up. You can't fix that. You can't change that. But what you can do is make sure that you don't hand that same broken arrow down to the generation that comes after you. You be the one that straightens out the flight of that arrow. And here's the mercy and grace in all of this. God isn't asking you to fix 30 years of marriage in one day. He's just asking you to make a decision, to take a step, to begin the process. Reach out a hand, say the sentence, choose forgiveness. You aren't just given this arrow to hit a target of becoming one flesh for the two of you. It's such a bigger story than that. You were given this arrow to build something that outlasts you. So aim well, not just for tonight, but for those people that are going to inherit the legacy that you leave. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, God, I just thank you that you gave us this beautiful gift of physical intimacy. And God, you told us what it's to look like, that it's reserved for a husband and wife in a lifelong marriage. And we talked about all the reasons that you designed it that way. God, but I thank you of the beauty that it creates in the way you intended it to work. God, I thank you for this gift that brings us together, God. God, I just pray. I pray for our marriages. God, there are people here who have good marriages who can get even better. There are people here who are kind of treading water, who are kind of in the pool, just afraid to make the next step. And there are people here who are really struggling. God, I just pray that you give them the courage, the forgiveness, the strength, the love to make the changes. That you let them build a relationship that brings you honor and glory, that brings them joy and happiness, and hands their kids something that looks different than what they were handed by their parents. God, I thank you for your love. I thank you for your son. And I ask all of this in your son's name. Amen.